Thank you. So hi, I'm Mike Reinitz. I currently am project manager at US Bank. I've been there for about a year. I've been part of the Eagle Group for a little bit longer. Really like what you guys do. Really like what we do as the group. At the end of the last uh, Wednesday night meeting, the monthly meeting where General Bess had talked, uh, we stayed on the line a little bit longer, and Michelle and Bruce and I were talking a little bit about maybe a topic around um, military affinity groups, because General Bess was talking about those. We have military affinity groups and other groups within US Bank, and uh, we were talking about how do you fit into that culture. So um, and not only that, but how, as a veteran, can we better fit into the culture? Is there any good takeaways? And uh, kind of came up with a topic together. Michelle said I should talk, schedule a time. Thank you, Michelle. Um, and I spent some time coming up with my key points and a couple uh, themes that I want to talk about. But I didn't have a whole bunch of time to actually script this out. So bear with me as I go through it. So my themes today for talking about military affinity groups or affinity groups and how do you fit into that company culture, really there's three key themes that you should always be considering when you're looking for that next role and when you're still in the company. How do you get involved? And those themes are, how do you find the company culture that you want to fit within? The other theme is, how do you assess that culture during that interview process or that uh, transition process? What are the right cultures for you? And the third one is, how do you deploy yourself and engage yourself within that new company culture when you come on board? What are some of the takeaways that you might want to think about to ensure that you are fitting in? And if they don't have affinity groups, maybe you have a chance for leadership and for starting one. So on the first theme about how do you fit into the culture, there's one thing is about what is culture, right? We should probably start there. Culture, if you would go to the books, might say something like, and I made this one up, is culture is the embodiment of societal, social, and workplace norms which are represented by how people work and interact daily to achieve the requirements of the job and the goals of the organization, right? You might be able to find something like that on the internet. But really what culture is the way that we do things around here. I have some experience in my past life with trying to change culture around maybe some processes, but I've never really been able to change culture. What culture really is the way that we do things, right? So if you want to change culture, if you try to change something specific about the culture, it gets away from you. HR people might think that they put out a new program or a new slogan, or your boss comes up with some thing that, banner they're going to put up in the workplace, and that's going to drive culture change. Well, it really doesn't. It's about how we engage with each other and how we work together. And do we share those common norms? And do we talk about those? And that's really what culture is. So you can't often try to change it if you're a quality guru. Deming says no slogans, right? And he's onto something there. The slogan isn't going to change the culture. People are going to come up with an anti-slogan against your slogan. People are going to maybe be avoidant of trying to change that culture. So you really, if you focus on that culture is the way we do things around here and be as simple as that, it's a great starting point for thinking about how do you fit into that culture. The second part of how do you fit in is really think about the types of affinity groups that you currently are in. So affinity just means things that are similar to each other. and we talk about like affinity buckets, things that appear to be similar. So you have affinity buckets like your friends, and that might be work friends, church friends, school friends, sports bar friends, right? You might have the family groups, and there might be different family groups. You might be the extended family, the close family, uh, the in-laws, the outlaws. Uh, you also have other affinity groups that are maybe your current work group, right? Or your neighbors, if you're thinking about that transition. So if you think of things as an affinity groups, those are people that have some commonality, not total commonality, but they're brought together for some reason. And that is the basis of workplace affinity groups, is to try to get some people with some shared values, some shared thoughts, and to be able to leverage those things and work with each other for the betterment of the people in the group, right? And Eagle Group and this Tuesday meeting is really a good example of a solid affinity group. And the last thing is for culture is trust your gut. You know when the group that you're in is a good group, right? It feels right. The other thing is, when you're in a group that doesn't feel right. And really, this is when Bruce and Michelle and I were talking at the end of the meeting about fitting in. And everybody, right, has horror stories about how some group or some company didn't quite work. And when you're in the service, there's probably some team that just was difficult to be with, right? And they maybe were, just maybe it was the Air Force, right? And we kind of tease each other, right, Steve, about the Air Force and the Army and the Marines, right? So there's similarities, but there's maybe things that are different. And when there are differences, you can like things about them and appreciate them for their differences. But then there's some things where you would say, I don't want to be part of that group because I just don't think they're aligned with my values and where I want to be. And I have an example of a company that I worked for about 9 months. I interviewed, asked the right questions. The owner was telling me that this is where they're going to go. I just felt like it was right. But I also felt like there was some underlying things going on. And I knew people in my network that had worked there. And I could have, but I didn't talk to them about why they left, right? Because I was thinking they left and they probably have a bad taste in their mouth about something, right? And one guy that posted on Google reviews said, worst company ever to work for. And here I am on the first day there for my interview, walking around the plant, being shown around by the operations manager, and I see the guy over there working that just put up a Google review. I thought, well, why is he back here, right? That could have been, I could have taken a moment and maybe talked to that person, right? I could have maybe thought a little bit more about it, or it could have driven me to talk to the other people in my network to say, should I be here or not be here? And later on, after I did get hired, I talked to the guy and he said, I really don't like it working here. I hate the operations manager. I hate the owner. They're all about themselves. Well, why didn't you come back? I needed the money. So I'm here because my unemployment ran out. I want to come, I need to come here to make money, but I'm looking for the next role. And then soon thereafter, they had a cost cutting and I was part of that cost cutting, right? But if I would have listened to my gut and if I would have talked to the people that would have known something, I probably could have avoided that. So that your gut will tell you if it's the right culture or not. So how do you assess that culture when you're looking, or maybe in that interview process? So there's the internet, right? I told you about Google surveys or Google feedback, right? You can go in there and see what Glassdoor is saying, their feedback from the people on Glassdoor. You can go to company websites, whatever company you're researching, it might be big companies and there might be a lot of information, but for those smaller companies, are the tightly held companies like private employers, you might not be able to find that information out. So you've got to go to your network, right, and reach out and assess, right? So the first thing is assess through the internet if you can. They'll give you some insight. Assess through your network would be your second key point there. Find people that know people that have worked there to give you that insight whether or not it's going to be a good cultural fit. And then the third thing is when you actually are in the interview, that is a two-way street. You have the chance to ask those questions. And if you miss out on it or you ask the wrong questions, you're going to end up in a situation like I was, where I should have known better for that one company, right? I could have asked more of the hard-hitting questions of the owner about how he treated people. And I could have asked the operations manager, how do you treat people, right? What is a good culture? How do you know if an employee is good or not? What do you do if you think the employee isn't providing the value that they need to provide? And I think the operations manager would have said, oh yeah, we fire people all the time, right? So I could have dove in and had that opportunity to really get a good insight. So it's a two-way street. The other piece about the interview is a lot of people don't take that chance to really ask those people within the interview process if it's going to be a good fit for them. I just hired somebody recently, and except for the person I hired, no one asked me the culture questions, which surprised me. And not because that one person asked me the culture questions did I hire them, but everybody else seemed like they were out for a job. They just wanted to get that next paycheck. They could have asked me about what's it like to work in the company? What's it like to work for me as a boss? What are ways that I can engage myself when I do start at the company, not just into work, but into that larger community, right? And that larger culture. So one of the takeaways for you guys is to make sure you have questions that dive into that for you within your interview process. And then Alan and everybody else, when you're coaching people, if you're not asking those questions, you might be overlooked. And one of the reasons why I landed at US Bank is I asked those culture questions of the people I interviewed. And I got feedback from both my hiring manager and my main peer that no one asked questions like that. And they thought it was really interesting that I wanted to know what it was like to work at the company. And the recruiting manager, and I've worked with him before, or since, excuse me, not before, but since, he said, I'm a great business partner because I think strategically about how I want people to come in the organization and how well they fit. Well, I don't want somebody to come in and only get that paycheck, right? I want them to be engaged and be driving for the same strategic goals. But then also there have to be that work balance. You know, it's not all about work, but it's about working with other people and the camaraderie, right? So with Eagle Group, we look at the camaraderie piece too, right? So I want people to feel like they fit into the culture. And this might be a way to segue into that third theme, which would be deploying yourself and engaging within that culture, is once you're in that culture, you have to deploy yourself and you have to be authentic. And I saw something on a leadership post from LinkedIn, and it was referring to a Forbes article that just came out. And one of the themes inside that article about leadership was authenticity, right? So don't go in asking the culture questions if you really don't think that you care about the answer, right? Ask those questions that are going to be really pertinent to you and how you fit, right? And that's your one point in the interview, to make it about you. So when you get in, you also have to take that authenticity into shaping the culture around you as best as you can, or fitting into that culture by being authentic and saying, how do I fit in, right? What's the onboarding plan? Do I have a peer that is going to be assigned to me to help me fit in, right? Is there somebody that's going to help me not with the forms I had to fill out and the workload that I'm taking on and those types of things, the standard operation things, but the other side, which is that peer mentor type of relationship that you need to develop or start building, right? So the second thing is on that theme about deploying yourself is build your network, right? So the very first people you're going to engage with is going to be your supervisor, probably a subject matter expert that's going to train you, but then ask for that peer that's going to help guide you through those obstacles in the organization that only somebody that's been around a while will understand. And that's where your network starts, right? So start embedding yourself into the organization through those collaboration pieces and the discussions with other people about, you know, what is it like working here, and if it is work related, you know, you can dive into that side too, right? What is the SOP? You can ask those questions about how did you navigate through all the SOPs? How did you reduce the exposure to the quality issues that everybody has when they start working on a new SOP? But then also on the other side of things, talk to the people that are going to be around you and not only engage in trying to find those internal friends, but build that internal network like you're doing now in your job search. And the last thing is become involved, right? So once you're building that internal network, you'll find those areas that you are excited about being part of, right? And those are those affinity groups that large companies might have. So the National Guard has African American, Asian, Spectrum. They have the Veterans Group, Disability. Well, no, I'm sorry, that's US Bank. But so Sandy Best was talking about all those different groups that she's involved in. US Bank also has those diversity groups, right? Or those business resource groups, we call them. Get involved in something like that if they're available. So Proud to Serve is one of the best ways, if you get hired at US Bank, is to be engaged, is to get into that Proud to Serve group. And Adam Narika counseled me saying when I did start at US Bank, get involved in those directions, and I've taken it to heart. So I'm also involved in the business development group. There's a community pillar and also a development pillar. So it's actually 3 groups that I'm involved in. If you get into a company that doesn't have some type of affinity group, make one, right? Make one yourself, and that's where your leadership can shine. If you get into a smaller company and you know there's people that have military background, meet with them for lunch once a week. If you have a disability, right, through the VA, you know, tinnitus, some of us have tinnitus. Maybe you find people that have some type of disability, right, that you could network with and create a group around. So it's really up to you to find that company culture that you fit within, to assess that company during your interview process to see if it really feels like it's right, like you would fit in and you'd want to be there. And the third one is when you get in, deploy yourself. And if you can't find a way to deploy yourself, you can always reach back out to the network, and you can reach out to people like Mike Pavic, for example. He's deployed himself within MTS. He can give you some other pointers on how to be engaged. Alan, for example, very networked, right? And he has some other ideas that, and Michelle too, right, that can help you figure out how to get engaged or even create those business resource groups for a small company, which would add a lot of value to the people that are at the company and would also have your star shine. And people would say, well, we got to keep this guy around because when it's time for cost cutting, because he's engaged and he's actually made our culture better. And he's maybe gotten us hooked up with Eagle Group and brought in other people from the network connections of veterans and we have more veterans that we've hired, and they've all been good hires. So we want to keep that going. I think that's pretty much it. I kind of veered from my notes a little bit. Is there any questions that you guys want to ask me?
I actually have some questions. First, that was outstanding, Mike, from coming up those 3 different parts of that. Really informational. And I really appreciate your speaking for us tonight. I want to go back to the second part where you were talking about assessing the culture from within the interview. Because I don't know, I think sometimes folks are a little afraid to ask that question in the interview, that, doing that interviewing from the other direction. And you said, folks don't know necessarily the right questions to ask. And I think you gave us a little bit of a taste of one, but how do you frame the right questions to ask without saying like, God, is it a hot mess around here? What do those questions sound like?
Well, first of all, be authentic, right? Don't just go to the internet or listen to me and repeat what I say. It has to come from you. One of the best ways to try to develop those questions would be think about it as a 20-minute interview, right? The 20-minute networking questions, right? You want to make the questions about them, but to give you the information that you need, right? So in talking with, let's say, the owner of that one company, I asked questions that were about him, right? And I wanted to kind of feel, how do you run the organization, right? Those types of things. And I asked some questions, but I never took that other step, the last step of the 20-minute networking, and to have it kind of come back to you, right? If you don't get something answered, how do you make it about yourself, right? And I know it's not supposed to be about yourself with the 20-minute networking, but really it is, right? It's what is that next contact? Who can help me next, right? So it's taking that last question and saying, how do I fit in, right? And help guide me on how you are going to help me fit into this company, and then you can expand it to those culture type questions. How do I know that this is the right culture? What brought you in, right? So think about that, mull it over, and when you make it authentic and make it about yourself, and you're going to come up with the right things. Don't be political, right? So if you have, like, going through this last election cycle, whether or not you like how it's turning out, if that's in in the forefront of your mind, wipe that clean, because you don't want to have things like that or other maybe a past experience, being a little bit jaded from being let go of cost cutting. Don't have it be about cost cutting. How are your finances? Will I be able to stay here a while? Am I going to get let go? Right? You don't want to have those fears be so much prevalent that you're going to have them say, well, there's something going on here, right? But make it about how you want to fit in, and how do you know that I'm going to fit in, and use those 20-minute networking questions as a guide. And then you could mock interview those questions with somebody else, right? And that's one thing that you could do on the Tuesday meetings, is just see if it works right, see if it feels good, get comfortable asking those types of questions. Then you'll be able to shine in that interview.
Mike, I'm going to add something. One thing I did, like with the last interviews I had at Express Scripts with the recruiter and the hire manager, I looked at them. They both had been with the company for several years, and through different iterations of mergers and acquisitions. And they just went through Cigna merger, or actually Cigna bottom up. And I had just simply asked, so in your time there, what has been the easiest time of transition? As far as throughout your time, how has this transition to Cigna differed from when Medco was merged with Express Scripts? And I ask questions like that because then it gets into, lets them explain why it is they're there. It lets them talk about the good things in the company without having to ask, hey, so why do you like being here?
Good point. It makes me think of when I interviewed at US Bank, there's those gaps in my resume, right? That I was out for about 3 months, 2 times because of the cost cutting. And they asked about that. My hiring manager wanted to know why. You know, I had my story, right? I shouldn't say, you know, story like I faked it, but I had the way that I was going to present it. You know, it was about cost cutting. I had the reasons why, and then we moved on. And there was no question, you know, there was no follow-up question like I was covering something up, right? So it was authentic, and she took it as that. When it came time for me to ask questions, I actually changed from my list of questions to a question that kind of went back to that gap. And I said, you know, you asked me about the gaps, and I did tell you about cost cutting. I've seen in news articles about US Bank that there's been waves of cost cutting before. Can you tell me what the security is around this role? And she said, at US Bank, it's a big organization, things change. And she said over the past 25 years that she's been there, she's probably had 13 different jobs in 12 different departments. And then she talked to me about getting involved, working with other people, creating your network internally. So when it comes time for those shifts, because customers' desires shift, right? So the bank has to change how they're going to handle a certain market. And during that change, if you're the person that's resilient and you've created that network, they're going to say, well, I want Kelly in this organization, right? And that's how she's moved through the organization as those changes have happened. So I'm trying to do that, right? I'm working with the other people, and I'm trying to build that internal network. So when change happens, I'm going to be able to move with the change within the bank. So,
well, and one of the other questions, and I was asked that question, what happened to my last employer? And I basically said, well, sadly, COVID caused some reorganization within the company, and on the contractors were all released from their contract early. I worked on a great team, but you know, COVID happened.
yeah. Any other questions?
I think maybe circling back on Michelle's question to help some of the folks on the call, specific questions. In general, you want to walk out of the interview being able to explain what the role is and how you fit in, right? So some specific questions you would ask is, what is the role, or how's the role, being communicated to others? What's really needed, right? Then also you can ask questions about the dynamic of the team. Is the leader very hands-on? Do you have remote players? Are you working with a global team? Do the teams often have big projects that are very time-bound, right? Or project specific? Do you have, additional resources that are external to the company that you may have to manage or be in charge of? You want to talk a lot about the responsibilities and leeway that you may have, because autonomy and kind of impact without authority is a huge thing nowadays. Also cross-functional roles and responsibilities that you can get out. Always ask more questions. And the last piece that I would say here that I was really catching on I think you were inferring is you can ask questions about the role or any of these culture questions at any point in the interview, and you can incorporate it or have them kind of be a question back that helps you clarify your response, right? So if they ask you, well, how do you think you're going to fill this role? Let me answer that, but first I may have a question on this specific bullet point, right? It may be general to you, but when you're asking a question, you may fire back and say, to answer that question effectively, are you talking in this bullet point about this or that, right? And then that allow you to really get succinctly. And I would say that my last question to you, Mike, you talked about the change, right? The whole key here is that not only when you're looking for a job or you're interviewing for that role, but when you're in that job and you're looking at moving up, are you finding that, understanding the changes because you understand the culture is helping you at US Bank really know where you might want to make some of those networking connections? Are you finding that helpful? Let's say maybe there's change in IT and that's the group that you need to start making inroads with, or so forth?
Yeah, great to see you, Les. It's been a while. Really good points, right? So don't only ask that culture question piece, right? And I think you hit it where you can ask and start to understand the culture as you're going through your other questions, right? So it's important to know that what the job's about, what your expectations are. Depending on how they answer it, sometimes you might be able to hear that they think that something's not quite right. And in my background being continuous improvement, a lot of people feel like they can talk to me about those things that aren't right, those pain points, or you'll start to get a little bit of a sense of that. And you can, for me, I would ask questions back to them around what you just said. It sounds like, working with other teams or working with the systems, there's some inefficiencies. And then you can dive into the inefficiency part, and then also maybe ask a little bit about that culture piece, right? It's like, why are you having, is it only the system that you're having issues with, or is it because there is some hierarchy or silos, right? And you can get into finding out about your job and get the culture piece starting to, to develop that, right? To understand that. I think the last piece around how do you navigate when you're in the organization? For a large company, not that it's easier, but if the communication is going well with a large company, just found out today that the person that's in charge of continuous improvement for the payments group, Deb Murphy, is leaving, and she's going on to a new sales role. There's an opportunity there. They're going to need somebody within that organization to take her role. There's probably going to be movement within that organization, and there might be movement from outside that group, but within the bank for those new roles. I know 3 of the people within her organization, right? So now I have those contacts, and I'm working with 2 of them on projects. So although we're all within the same payments organization, they're not within my hierarchy. They're not within my chain of command, right? So understanding the lay of the land, understanding that changes might happen, if you've built your network right while you've started, it's going to come back to you hopefully at some point in the future, right? And you can't make those connections when that next opening is there, right? You can't say, hey, I want to get to know you less because I know that there's a job that you have that I want and I think I'm qualified for. You have to start building those networks, and you can't focus only on what you think your next role is. You have to think more broadly. How do I get engaged with a lot of different people to understand where those next opportunities come from and where they might be? And then can you get me to that next person, right? And like for OCR technology, right? We talked a little bit about that, and you led me to somebody that had OCR technology, right? Those connections and those projects will lead you to those next people that you still need to network with and build that relationship with, because at some point they might come back to you. But only if you've built that relationship are you really able to prove to other people that you can get that next role, because you've shown them by the work that you've done with them that you are capable, maybe not quite ready for it or ready for it.